Buskirk. Welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
See you, Chris.
Yeah, good to see you.
So we are 5 days out from the election, and obviously we're going to talk about a lot of interesting polling that you're doing, the sort of closing argument, but I think a lot of our listeners would appreciate hearing a little bit about your background, what sort of got American Greatness started, and where you sort of were in 2016.
Yeah, so gosh, I haven't gotten asked that question for a while. That was like the big 2016 and 17 question for me.
Very edgy.
But yeah, so I'll just give you the give you the sort of the brief bio and the kind of the why for American Greatness. But basically, kind of short version is when I was college graduate student, I was in Claremont, so I worked for the Claremont Institute. So I've sort of got that sort of educational background. And so that was, informed the way I thought about politics for a long time. And but I wound up not pursuing politics as a career ultimately, and just was an entrepreneur for a long time. And then in 2015 I had sold a company and was sort of trying to figure out what I wanted to do afterwards. And then there was a point, I guess, maybe late 15, when I started to think, wow, there's this crazy New York real estate developer who I just realized is actually totally serious about wanting to be president. And I had heard from a couple of people, like in my private life, who are, very sober, sensible, small c conservative, like they're political conservatives, but they're just personally conservative people. And this would have been like August, September of 15. And they're like, wow, I really think Trump is going to do it. Like, I'm really drawn to him. And if you knew these people, like they're professionals or whatever, they would be the least likely people you would have thought in 2015 would have thought that Trump was interesting. And so I sort of started paying attention to that. And my big takeaway, I guess, at the time was, this is a really unique political moment and maybe a good time to get back involved in a meaningful way. And, I had the time. I was at the right point career-wise. And so in early 16, I got together with a couple of fellow sort of Claremont aligned people and said, we should do something here. And so wound up launching American Greatness middle of 16. We knew who we wanted to win at that point. Didn't know who would win. It was all sort of very, happening in real time. And so we launched in the summer of 16, and it's, it's just been like a ride ever since.
Certainly. Chris, one thing I think would be interesting for people to hear is that anytime anyone asks me, they're like, what does the intellectual, Trumpism look like? And obviously, I have to point to your publication, Julius Krein's American Affairs, a few other things, Tucker Carlson's show maybe. And these are the things that I can point to as concrete. As somebody who represents that themselves, how do you view it in terms of Trump the man? Do you view yourself as adherent to an ideology, which Trump espoused in 2016? Or do you view it to connected to Trump, the politician, the man, and continue to keep that as your mission going forward, even whatever happens in this election?
Trump was interesting and ultimately won, and continues to be the most compelling candidate because he talked about things that are that nobody else wanted to talk about. That's a phrase I've used. I didn't make it up, unfortunately. I read it, but I don't know who made it up first. Was like we had this bipartisan fusion party,
right? And
everybody there were certain sort of pieties that everybody agreed with if you were within that ecosystem, but it was totally different than what most people in the deplorables or normies or interior Americans or whatever was actually important for those people. And one of the things that I've tried to think through is this is going to sound like a contradiction, maybe it is, but how to be less ideological in some things. And it maybe I kind of come to the conclusion you got to marry your ideology with the material world. Right, so the Marxists always want to be materialist, and the conservatives always want to be idealist in some way, and that's neither one seems right. Your theory has to have a practical application that actually benefits people, and so I come back to, well, what is it what do we actually want, right? And when you talk about politics, it's like, the questions are like basically who is going to rule and what do they want.
Mhm.
And the conservative version of that is always something like liberty, maybe virtue is another version of that. And then sort of the left-wing version of it is equality or justice.
Yes.
That's, that, right. Those, but I don't, I mean, sure, those all sound great, right? But okay, now what? Like we've all agreed to this piety, but now what are we supposed to actually do? And so that's why I've tried to think, well, what does the ideology actually look like in practice? And I think, well, we want a nation that is secure from foreign threats. We want a nation that has that has a high capacity for collective action, and we that's sort of at a high level, at a national level. At the personal version of it is that we want a nation that where families are being formed and children are being had in a way, in sufficient numbers to carry on the civilization that we have here, and we want people to be physically healthy. I mean, these are just sort of like basic things that are essential to life. We want what I always call the pre-political institutions to be strong, vibrant, vital, thriving. What are those? It's religious institutions, it's the family. And if you have those things, you have a pretty healthy society, and you've managed to concretize some of these abstractions, and then you can start to think more clearly about, okay, how do we go about doing those things? But you have to be really clear about what it is you want. And I don't know that Donald Trump thinks about it very exactly in those terms, but he was sort of talking about the first derivative of those things, like securing the border, raising wages, bringing manufacturing back. Those were things that actually would make a material difference in people's lives. And it's why you saw you sort of had the Obama Trump vote crossover voter. It's why you had especially in those Rust Belt states, you had people maybe who hadn't voted or whatever, the old Reagan Democrats, or at least maybe their kids voting for Trump, because they're like, oh yeah, that's actually what I need. This is why I hate politics, is because everybody's talking about stuff that's up in the air. This guy's saying, like, I want you to be able to get a good manufacturing job in Michigan that pays $30 an hour.
Yeah, so that's a good. And obviously there's to your point about whether or not Trump would articulate things quite that way. Like that's an important sort of thing to note. But I think there's the immediate thing that someone's going to sort of think about in this situation is there's the 2016 version of Trump, right? And then there's the 2020 version of Trump, who's running for re-election after having governed for 4 years, and who also isn't running against Hillary Clinton. Because I think, especially if the poll, and I know we'll get into polling in a bit, but if the majority of, if the election next week goes the way the majority of polls indicate it will go, I think an underlying dynamic with a lot of people who were sort of interested in the new right undercounted after 2016 was how much everything had to do with Hillary Clinton as being the perfect foil for Trump. And for a lot of people, it wasn't simply that Trump was articulating populist nationalism in a new way, but it was just that Hillary Clinton, after 30 years on the scene, was just sort of the worst person to represent the status quo you could sort of imagine. There's a world where I think President Obama could have been as neoliberal as he was, and you could have articulated everything you just said, and he still would have handily beat Trump. So how do you just think about that dynamic as we're sort of going into this election?
It's the sort of 16 versus 20 version. Is that what you mean? Yeah, I mean, look, the 16 version, I think there's part of it that's absolutely right, which is that there was Hillary Clinton was just so distasteful to a lot of people, and she was a very easy person to dislike, and so the part of that made it. I was about to say part of it made it easier for Trump, but that's probably objectively true. But gosh, it seems like sort of Pollyanna-ish 4 years ago, after until like a week after the election, everybody's like, no, Trump can't win, and then now here we are 4 years later going, no, it was easy because of Hillary Clinton. It wasn't easy, but the point is still the same, which is that she had a Hillary Clinton had been very much front and center in public life and had a reputation for corruption that was widely known, even if people disagreed with it. Obviously, Democrats thought she was doing great. I think maybe they were just in on the grift or whatever, but that definitely helped to say, you know, all the lock her up chants, and then there was the Clinton Foundation stuff, and then there was the, you know, the bleach bits of her emails and all those things. And it just played into a long running narrative about the Clintons, and that was helpful. You know, the stuff we find out in 2020 is that, you know, is that like the Bidens were trying to do the same thing, but being like lower IQ, they did the same thing, but they weren't as good at it as the Clintons.
So, Chris, I think that's interesting. Let's talk about this in the context of Trump himself. A couple days out from the election, your organization has gotten a lot of attention for having, I would say, polls that are not within the rest of the mainstream. They're certainly not looking in that direction. Could you maybe just explain to the audience why that phenomenon is? What are the different techniques that you were using? Why do you think that that is superior to the rest of the polling industry? Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, let me just, I guess I'll start with some context here. And that is, you know, I'm not a pollster. I don't personally do the polling. Having said that, though, just, you know, I had talked earlier about my, you know, my sort of professional business life. That was a big parts of that were actually dependent upon being able to do a lot of accurate statistical modeling. So I can, and that was helpful because what my goal was when we decided we wanted to do some polling was we just wanted to find people who we thought were smart, were honest, and didn't hate Trump. And they don't have to be pro-Trump. I don't care. What I didn't want was somebody who was just, you know, basically had a dog in the fight. You know, regardless of who they, you know, I didn't want somebody who was like just a rabid partisan. And so when we went out to find who we wanted to work with, it was very important to find people who, you know, sort of fit those criteria. But the sort of the where the rubber meets the road for any pollster is their model, and then their ability to survey people who fit into the model. And because the model is everything, you know, in a lot of ways, because what you try and do is you try and model the electorate as accurately as you can, the actual electorate that you're predicting is going to show up on election day, or in this environment, you know, at least from 4 weeks up to election day, and then on election day too. And then they need to be able to execute and survey people who fit into that model. And so that's like that for every pollster. That's essential. Like if you are modeling that the electorate is going to be, you know, I don't know, a 75% affluent white female liberals, right? The AWFLs, you're going to get a certain outcome. You just are, right? I mean, but so what you got to do, and you got to do this on a state by state basis, and you got to try and figure out, like, you know, who voted in 18, who voted in 16, you know, who voted. It gets harder as you go back further, but what you're trying to do is figure out who is going to vote in 2020. Is it, you know, it's going to be, you know, you have your demographic indicators just based on race, you have party, you have sex, you have education levels, all of these things. And, you know, there's people, how do I want to say this? People, especially you see this in the media, want to treat polls like it's hard science, like this is chemistry. It's not. Okay, it is. There is an art to it, and that's why you got to take a lot of these polls, especially the commentary on the polls, with a huge grain of salt, because they never want to recognize that there is an art to it. There's the science aspect is just, you know, trying to do the math on the model, but it's a person making a decision on what that model looks like. And so we found people, and we said, look, you come up with your model, show it to us. If it's something that we think is rough, you know, not crazy, you know, because I had I want to make this clear. Like, I had no input on the model other than to say, show it to us. We want to see it's kind of passes the sniff test, but this is what you do. And so, you know, that's basically where we think we're going to find that the polling that we've done is more accurate than a lot of the polling that is out there. It's like, you know, today there's an ABC Washington Post poll of Wisconsin that says that Biden is leading by 17. there is no planet on which that is accurate. It's just not true. And, that means that Trump is underperforming Wisconsin by 18 points versus 2016. And it's some of the stuff, it's like laughable. And so you wonder, like, are they just bad at this? Are they gaslighting everybody? Is this a psyop? Like, are they political partisans who are trying to game some of the averages that are out there? What are they doing? I don't know the answer, but what I do know is that Biden's not winning Wisconsin by 17. It's just not a credible response. It's not a credible output from a poll.
So do your polls have Trump winning then?
So I'll give you an example. So we released a Florida poll yesterday. We had done one, I guess we released it, I think it's 11 days ago. Same pollster, same model, same methodology, had Trump down like 2.8, I think. That back then, the one we released yesterday had Trump up 4. It's a big swing. Now I guess number one is, was that number 2 weeks ago 100% right? I guess I want to say none of these polls are 100% right. You're trying to get as close as you can, right? So
Yes.
what part of what I will try to tell people is just to demystify what polls are in the first place. So that's number one. Number two is like, okay, if we think that's true, if we think they're basically, mostly getting it right, what changed? And so that's where it's interesting to look at the underlying data and to see, well, okay, what was it that changed in that poll? And really you could identify it to 2 groups in the Florida poll, which is that Trump was, and we've seen this across the board, Trump was underperforming with women, and he was underperforming with over 65 voters in general. And in both cases, he didn't take the lead with them, but he closed that gap, and that was enough to put him back in the lead.
I find this all, I that's one of the reasons we really wanted to have you on, because I was like, we got to talk to somebody who's got just polls which are different. I think one thing, though, which is that as an intellectual person who agrees with many of the reasons why, and I find myself in total agreement with the things that you articulated about making things real for people's lives and making the pre-political institutions stronger, is itself now what the New Right's political project is all about. If Trump were to win, or actually, let's just step back. From an electoral prospect, how has his governance record lined up with the things that motivated you to start your organization, to espouse this political ideology, and to align it with Trump himself? Like, how has that played out in your view? Because I would say it's, pretty mixed bag. Some of the things that I cared about a lot absolutely did not happen, mostly on the economic front. I think on the social front, I think he definitely did deliver, but that the economic part was a huge reason why so many of these Obama-Trump voters even came over to him in the first place. What's your perspective on that heading into the election 5 days out?
So I think, when you dig into some of the policy, I agree with the basic statement. It's a mixed bag. In general, I think Trump's done pretty well. And I guess I would add to that, better than anybody else who was running in 2016 as a Republican would have done on the issues that matter to me, or I think maybe to you, or to sort of the new right people. Definitely has performed better. Are there places where I wish he had done more, or maybe didn't do anything or whatever? Yeah, 100%. How much I also temper my expectations of whoever whoever I'm supporting. But here's the bigger thing is that as somebody who is obviously involved in this every day, like I've got in my mind I've got this super detailed list of like policies that I really would like to see enacted and that I think would be good things. And I will continue to say why I think those things are good and would be helpful and be good for people. But the single biggest thing that I think Trump does, and he's done this really, really well in a way that nobody else on the scene today could do, is that he exposes the absolute intellectual and moral bankruptcy of the elite class that presumes to govern this country. And that is, I think, a profoundly important role that he plays, because it what he's doing is he's opening people's eyes to the fact that, we don't have expertise, we have credentialism. We don't have a publicly minded, publicly interested elite. What we have is like this parasitic class that's trying to figure out just how do they get theirs. And to the extent that he exposes that, which I think he does very well, that is an extremely important thing, because it helps clear the decks, so that there can be something new that's built, partially while he's in office, and then of course after he leaves, whether that be in a few months or a few years.
So this is fascinating. I really like the way you articulated that, because I think it gets to a key debate within sort of this broader worldview, which is that I can buy the critique. I could buy the idea that he sort of opened up, let's say he shifted the Overton window, changed the sort of chess pieces in 1516, but I don't think anyone could look at the rise of Joe Biden and could look at the post-COVID world, and not even post because we're still in it, and think that anti-credentialism, I think, has been advanced as a project. And I think that the other sort of problem here, and this is what I'll let you respond, but also sort of raise this question, which is that I think people on the right who support Trump should be asking themselves, people who aren't hacks, right? And you're not a hack, like you care about these ideas. If Trump held different ideas, I don't think you'd be supporting Trump. So the question is, what is the effect Trump has on these ideas? So for example, let's take immigration. Immigration was, for example, with the border wall, of why sort of things, the perfect example of an issue that you could argue that elite credential class was not able to deal with properly. But now, 4 years into Trump's presidency, support for expanding immigration is the highest it's been in 30 years. There's a reason why one of the few areas of policy that Joe Biden is going to be very precise on is his support of comprehensive immigration reform, is his sort of views on DACA, and it's because that viewpoint has become newly popular because of the way that Trump sort of governs. So how do we just sort of think about the role that Trump plays in those debates?
Yeah, I mean, there is a view that says that Trump is for like basically enforcing our immigration laws, controlling the border, reducing the amount of both legal and illegal immigration, and therefore he's poisoned the well on that. I don't subscribe to that view.
Quick correction to my statement. It's not that those. It's. I'm not talking about the policies per se, right? Like, because you just articulate. Like, I get what you're saying there, but I'm saying like the way that he does this. So the way that the Department of Homeland Security incompetently, from I think a policy and a PR perspective, manages sort of like the border crisis issue, especially sort of like the children, especially the way that these like suburban like white voters who are basically in the background of this entire conversation, the way they sort of see that happen and then recoil against that policy. So that's more, so less the policies precisely and more just the way that he goes about doing them.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple things I think that are going on there. One is that, some of these policies, like this came up in the debate the last week, like the whole cages thing. Well, that really was a policy that was begun under Biden, and some of it is just that this becomes a media-driven narrative, and it takes on a life of its own precisely because it is something that is being done in the Trump administration, even if it was done in a prior administration too. When it was done by the prior administration, either the people ignored it or whatever, and now that Trump is doing it, it's sort of like it's evil. I think the bigger issue is the one that you raised, which is like the one of competence. How are these agencies executing on these things? And this is in a way like, gosh, this is a huge issue for conservatives that, I sort of have sketched out something I want to write on this, but I won't do it till next year because the election has sucked up every possible second and every bit of oxygen. But like conservatives have this, it's in the conservative like DNA, which is that government bad, small government good. Like I basically I subscribe to that to a certain extent. But that goes, that then goes into goes to the point of parity, which is like, if you work for the government, you're a hack, and like you're necessarily incompetent, and like, all the DMV jokes or the post office jokes, right? Those things are true, right? Like, go to the DMV, it's usually pretty badly run, and you have to wait for 4 hours just to like, get a replacement license or something. But I don't know, try calling your bank or your airline and tell me you get a better experience. Like the experience you have with big business is not any better, and in a lot of cases is worse. And so like, I guess my point here is that a lot of these things are being done incompetently, but conservatives have been saying for 50 years, and basically have been memeing the reality that if you're a conservative and you're smart and you're ambitious, there's no way you should work in government. It's it's only the slobs who do that. And so when you drive smart people out of government, what do you expect? Right? Not that there aren't any smart people in government, but the point is that we should want good, smart people who are competent, who can execute on these things. We should want them in government, instead of just saying like, I don't know, why don't we only have the 4 departments that are called out in the original Constitution? I mean, like, I get that to a certain extent, but like, that's not something like, get back to me when you can do that. In the meantime, can we just run this thing competently?
Yes. Chris, you're identifying probably my chief beef with the conservative movement is, look at the administration. If you care about immigration, 2 of the things you should care a lot about were DACA and the census. And both of those things were lost at the Supreme Court out of sheer idiocy at the executive bureaucratic level. There's just no other way to describe it. Any competent administration would have been able to follow through on that. I think in some cases, trade, many of the ways that they have gone about implementing some of the things that they've tried have just been rank incompetence, which again is just, this is the real question. And one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you is there is a feeling amongst some people, I'm not saying it's our view, that if you care a lot about these issues, that you would have to wait it out and kind of wait until somebody who can emerge, who's actually competent and capable of doing this without poisoning the well of public opinion, to actually enact that agenda on the front. And ergo, it might be better if Trump just lost. And then, of course, I think there's probably a view more aligned with your own and maybe more emblematic of like the Michael Anton essay of Flight 93, which is that, no, that's ludicrous, which is that anything that you get, even the worst possible outcome with Trump, is better than a Democratic administration. Could you articulate that view and kind of counter the argument that I laid out?
Yeah, like there's a couple different versions, like of the other side, which is the sort of the accelerationist version, which is this, like, the trajectory here is towards destruction. So can we just get it over already? And that way, like, let it. That their version is like, I didn't start the fire, but I'm not putting it out, and I just wish it would burn down because I just want to get back to the business of rebuilding something that's better. And that's one version. The other version is, kind of like Trump's not as competent as he like, even though he talks about policies I like. He's kind of icky or whatever. That's always sort of underlying it. He's crass, and that's distasteful to me. And so, gosh, I'm just waiting, like, where's Lancelot? Like, I want somebody on a white horse. And both of those are wrong, right? I mean, it's we live in a fallen world, so let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I just fundamentally don't think you ever you don't win by losing. There are times, obviously, where, like, there is certainly such a thing as a strategic retreat, or there are times where in history where you can look and say, oh, they suffered that defeat, but I guess as it worked out, so X, Y, and Z happened, and maybe it worked out for the better. You cannot tell those things in advance, right? I can't tell you that if Trump loses, somehow somebody else is going to merge, and it's all of a sudden it's going to be magically better. And so you just have to I think have a certain faith in human agency and in the power of human action, and do the best. Like, you're trying to win. We have to be trying to win and to build now. And if the accelerationists are right, on their big point, which is that, this is, there's like sort of entropy in the system, or it's already, which I guess is true in every system. Well, okay, but I don't need to speed it up because I don't have that much knowledge or capacity to figure those things out. So in the meantime, let's try and do the best with what we have.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is something that we sort of, and everyone has sort of had to accustom themselves to, but if we're talking about political realignments, the most important realignment over the past 4 years has really been transfer of sort of education and class as being the most sort of defining thing that drives your voting decision. That's something that I think Trump leaned into, and definitely in its own way has sort of shifted things. So how should the GOP moving forward, Trump or not, be thinking about that reality that under a sort of more American greatness, or at least Trumpist agenda, you are going to see a situation where, it's probable that the suburbs of Northern Virginia that H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, John McCain, et cetera, sort of competed for are just gone forever, that states like Georgia and Texas are more competitive, that Philadelphia, Bucks County is not going to be your centerpiece. How should the right think about that dynamic? Because sort of the people within the GOP that I think would be opposed to sort of many of the viewpoints we say on this show and would be opposed to you would simply say that you're leaning too far into sort of this working class agenda. You're going to get us killed in the suburbs, and we can't actually put together a governing coalition. How do you sort of think about that dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that so the basic one of the frames that I think is accurate to think about what the coalitions are right now is it's sort of the it's elites plus elite aspirants, or you might call them the professional managerial class. I mean, the terminology can get confusing, but
we use PMC here, just to be clear.
PMC is fine. I mean, I would say PMCs are basically, in a way like demi elites or elite aspirants or whatever. So you have that class, and they're broadly aligned with the lumpen proletariat plus some sort of I guess there's some sort of other groups that have come together in that coalition who think that they wouldn't get power otherwise. American Muslims maybe are part of that. That's always been puzzling to people because American Muslims are they're sort of small C conservative and family oriented, and so a lot of right wing Americans think gosh, there's a natural. Mm-hmm. That seems like a natural bond, on a lot of things we would tend to agree. And that may actually be something that happens, but there's a perception, I think, in a lot of the, not all, by the way, but a lot of the Muslim community know the Democrats have our interests. And so we don't mind aligning politically with people with whom we disagree. But the point is that you sort of have the the elites, demi-elites, PMCs, plus a coalition, broadly underclass, but then some of these other small groups that kind of hitch their wagon to that political coalition. And they are all aligned against a broad middle class. And when I think about the broad middle, it's basically it's the working class and the middle class put together. The distinction there is hard to make for me. And so I think for Republicans or conservatives, not always the same thing. You sort of have to lean into that reality and say, this is a middle class party. We need to, I think, make a real attempt to find the elites that are aligned. Because you need elites who can govern, you need elites who do the things elites do, which is run the institutions, right? If you're running a major institution, by definition, you just became an elite or, adjacent at any rate. But the source of political power for conservatives is going to be the middle class. And we need to, but the problem with populist parties a lot of times is that they fizzle out because they don't have a governing class that is associated with them.
Yes,
and that's a place where conservatives have a sort of an ideological weakness because We've been taught to revere the founding era in this country, which we can do and should do without thinking that if we just win a couple more elections, it's going to be 1789 again, right? That social structure doesn't exist, right? So we do need to have a class that governs and runs institutions, but is aligned with the broad middle.
Yeah, it's funny, Chris. I'm thinking about this just in terms of, I remember when Trump said on the campaign trail, I thought it was a very poignant moment. He said in 2016, it's not the conservative party, it's the Republican Party. And of course, that drove the professional GOP establishment mad. And you're also getting to something that I said once, which is very controversial for a lot of leftists who probably listen to this podcast, who watch my show on Rising, is I was like, look, I'm not anti-elite by definition, like all the time. I'm anti the current elite. I'm like, I think our current elite sucks, and that we need to like reform it. And I think that, there's going to be some class division in America and in a Western capitalist society, and it can be more equitable, and we should talk about that. Here's the real question, is if Trump wins or loses, it will still be one of the great civil wars within the Republican Party about what his 2016 or 2020 victory meant, or what his 2016 victory and 2020 loss meant. Obviously, I think you know which both sides you and I are going to be on. But the dynamic that I see is that if Trump loses, is that they are going to try and paint a narrative that he lost because of his positions on trade and immigration, where I would say he probably had much more to do with his passage of the GOP tax cut in 2017, and with just the general lack of economic stimulus and the coronavirus pandemic together. What is the most effective way for people who are like-minded as you and I in order to prevail in that civil war? Because I see on their side hundreds of billions of dollars in capital, the entire GOP establishment machine, friends within the media and more, and a class of people who never really liked Trump all that much in the first place, and to the extent that they did, viewed him more as a guy who they could get their stuff done underneath rather than as somebody who they actually aligned with. I know that's a lot, but I just want to throw it all at you.
Look, if Trump loses, parentheses, God forbid, then the morning of November 4th, basically the sort of GOP, sort of the old Bushies, the neocons, the Nikki Haleys. Yes, let me say that again. The Nikki Haleys who rode the Trump train for
it's personal not even a
benefit.
Subtweet, by the way. That's just
What's that?
Outright. I said it's not even a subtweet. You just
not even.
I respect that. I respect that more.
Yeah, it's not even a subtweet. These were the people who will. Some will say it really explicitly. Some of them will just go about it, but will say it implicitly. But basically, they will go back to Bushism. They will go back to sort of being the right liberal party as opposed to being the conservative party, and it'll be back to the bad trade deals. It'll be back to importing cheap labor to undercut American workers. It'll be back to foreign military misadventures. They're extremely profitable for a lot of people. And I don't mean like Boeing, though that's true too. What I mean though is they're very profitable for a lot of people in DC.
Yes.
So people make money off of that, and then they sort of wrap that in, but democracy, track record, please. What are you, like 0-40? But please spend trillions more. This is like one of my favorite. This is one of my favorite subtweets of those people is like the State Department still does it on their State Department account as they talk about like every couple of weeks they've got somebody else there after. It's Belarus this week, and then it's it's some other country the following week, and I always. When I see it, I will always subtweet them and ask them like, how's Juan Guaido's presidency going? Because last I heard he was actually the legitimately elected president of Venezuela or whatever. Anyway, point being is that it'll just be back to if they have any say about it, and as you say, there are a lot of them. They're very well financed, and it'll be back to business as usual unless action is taken. I think that I think one of the big action items for I think one of the big action items for us is to start getting in front of candidates and existing elected Republicans with, sort of focus group data, polling data on issues, and say, you know what, we know that this is what everybody in the 202 area code is telling you. But in actuality, here's what your voters think. Here's what your voters want. And it's not going back. Like, if you want to be the junior partner in the Democrat-led government, just say it now. But if you actually want to do something positive for the country, if you want to win again, you need to put together a coalition, because the GOP coalition is just a straight electoral loser. I mean, not only is it bad for the country, but it's an electoral loser. It'll just continue shrinking.
Mm-hmm.
So for the last question, I think the immediate question would be for you, if Trump does win re-election, which is basically what a lot of this show today is premised on, what are going to be your number one agenda items from sort of an American greatness perspective?
Sorry, is that if he does or doesn't?
If he does, because just to add some editorial onto this, because something that I think has concerned a lot of people on the right is that you're going to see a Trump who is unmoored. And I don't just mean unmoored in the sort of sense of, oh, he's going to, do weird things with Kim Jong-un, but more in the sense of he'll be more and more captured by sort of deficit hawkery, sort of people who tell him, President Trump, the way to own the libs is to privatize Social Security. Oh, President Trump, the way to own the libs is actually to, go for a second round of tax cuts, because they would hate that, right? So I think that's something that a lot of people are sort of concerned about. So what's your sort of agenda, and what would you say to people who are going to try to sort of exploit that space? Because once again, that's clearly what happened in 2017 with the tax cuts and healthcare plan instead of infrastructure. So we've sort of seen this film already. It doesn't go very well, especially from a midterms perspective. So what's your agenda look like to finish this up?
Yeah, so I'm going to do policy second, because my number one item is actually that he rebuild the Republican Party in the image of America first, and that means that he needs to start really staffing the party. A lot of the people who are there now probably will want to leave anyway, and so it's time to start putting his people in control of the levers of power, because what that will do, excuse me, is that will help to that will help to cement the legacy and to bring new candidates into the party in 2022 and 2024 when they're doing candidate recruitment. We'll be getting the right people running in these districts, and it will change the trajectory of the institutional party itself. Related to that, I think that there are people who would be good hires for Trump for the West Wing, who for various reasons didn't go in the first term, who I think would go in the second term. So I think he needs to get other people who are smart, who would be loyal to him and wouldn't leak. I want to say one thing, I guess. A lot of America First people have a lot of criticisms for Jared. And there are places, there's important policy places where I disagree with some of the things that Jared Kushner has done. But the thing that Jared Kushner has done where he deserves credit is that he's been loyal to his father-in-law, and to my knowledge has not been one of those people who's been backstabbing him or leaking on him. I could be wrong on that, but that's my understanding. And this points to something that's important, which is that Trump has had a hard time implementing policy because he hasn't had people who've been loyal to him.
Yes.
But those people exist, right? There are people that he could bring in, I think, and I think he could get a very good West Wing staff in a second administration. So that's sort of on the personnel aspect. When it comes to policy, you said infrastructure. That's a big deal, right? Yes. I think that would be a very heavy lift. I would hope that it would be able to get done, but he should use political capital to do that immediately. I mean, there's substantive reasons why the infrastructure just needs to be rebuilt. I mean, go to LAX or go to JFK. And they're basically national embarrassments, among other things. There's all kinds of other infrastructure, and it would that needs
not
to
just
be,
the jet setting class. We have other concerns too.
yeah, gosh, look, roads, bridges, power plants,
Yes.
power transmission, the grid. All of these things need to be rebuilt, and that is one of those things, because first of all, it's a multi-trillion-dollar project that probably takes a decade or more. And as a result, it becomes a big national project. And doing big national projects, to go back to something I said earlier, like what's one of the marks of a successful society, it's a high capacity for collective action. And if everybody wants to say, well, let's go to the moon or let's go to Mars, fine. I'm for it, I guess, because there's things that go along with it, that with those projects, that are really good. The same thing could be said of a huge infrastructure initiative in this country. As it becomes a big national project, it's very tangible. There's this whole discussion of bits versus atoms. All the innovation has been in bits, not in atoms. Yeah, bridges and all those sorts of things. That's very I don't know. Bridges are very 4,000 BC. People have been crossing water for a long time. But it's nice to have new ones. It's nice to have ones that look good and that carry, and that where you're not getting stuck in traffic. It's great to have a power grid that's efficient. And those are tangible things that I think that's the sort of project that kind of, gosh, it sort of galvanizes the country together. So that, anyway, I think that's a big thing. I think that Trump could also take the next step on trade. His instincts on trade have been very good. The policies have been very good too. But when we talk about how do you raise worker wages, how do you make it possible for instance, a middle class family to live a middle class life on a single wage? Well, you have to raise wages. How do you raise wages? Reduce foreign competition, right? Make it profitable to build manufacturing here again, and that means you have to exclude some imports. That goes against sort of the free market fundamentalism of the libertarians who took over the Republican Party, at least that part of our policy making apparatus. But that would be something that I think would be very beneficial to rebuilding the middle class in this country. And there was an opportunity earlier this year, which I think was missed, but could be picked up again in a second administration. One of the things we found out, all of us, in March and April and May, is that hey, we can't even make N95 masks in this country. Hey, we don't make any antibiotics in this country. Oh, we don't make the precursor chemicals for the antibiotics in this country either. So even if we wanted to, we couldn't do it. I make that a priority. Legally make that a requirement. For instance, that some of those things have to be manufactured here, and say, going back to our polls, there was a question that we did a bunch of polling on, state level polling. We did it, we're doing all the ballot test questions, but on issues, we said, I want to get the phrasing right, but we said, would you be more likely or less likely to support a candidate who had a plan to make the United States self-sufficient in the production of food, energy, and healthcare, like healthcare goods or something like that? And it's like an 85% yes question. And it's really kind of funny, though, the way some of the breakout is because non-Republican groups, like non-traditionally Republican groups, answer yes at a higher level than traditional Republican constituencies on that stuff. Sort of like 50-year-old white male is classic Republican constituencies. They say yes in general, but they're at 60%, whereas Hispanic woman who's 25, she's at 90%, that demographic. And it's a common sense thing. It's of course we need to be self-sufficient at these things. We need to be secure in these things. And it's a place where I think it's good policy, but it's also really good politics if somebody's able to articulate that well.
Quick thing here before we take you out. I think you just highlighted a very important point, because sort of obviously as a Black person, I'm someone who looks at a lot of the sort of generic DC outreach to minorities in a really sort of frustrated way, because it's basically hey, if we just take the generic policy positions that the GOP has held for 30 years and make them sort of like quote unquote like Black and Hispanic friendly. They're like, vote for us, which is also what sort of leads to the immigration reform point. But what you're actually pointing out here is if you want to sort of expand the GOP's base, the GOP is actually going to have to change the policy priorities that you sort of get there. Like you're not going to get more Black or Hispanic voters by sort of doing like tax cuts and opportunity zones. Like those could be fine policies, but that's not like good politics. So I think you're getting at the political dynamic that sort of thing misses a lot. And I think people should hear that more.
Oh my God, Marshall. I mean, this is like one of the things that I find like so frustrating because like like DC like outreach to like in like, I don't know, like inner city Philadelphia would probably constitute something like, I don't know. What should we do? Let's do a
opportunity
rap
zone.
No,
Yeah.
we'll do a rap. We'll do a rap about corporate tax cuts.
Hey, but just a quick thing that may have gotten 50 Cent. So there is a market for is a tiny market for that.
And Lil Pump.
Yes, and Lil Pump.
So don't undercount that strategy. It's
I'm like, you want to win the inner city of Philadelphia? Rebuild it. I guarantee you a lot of people there would vote for you. But, you know, that's a little difficult. Chris, it's just been such a great conversation. Really appreciate your perspective, man. And please keep up the great work that you were doing over at American Greatness. We appreciate you joining us.
Yep. Thanks. It was fun.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Talk to you later.